was supposed to be just another press conference, a routine exchange of questions and carefully crafted answers. But what happened that day was anything but routine. When Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium, no one in the room expected what was about to unfold. She wasn't there to play it safe, dodge tough questions, or stick to the usual political script. Instead, she did something bold, something that left everyone watching completely stunned. In front of flashing cameras, a room full of reporters, and several prominent Democratic figures, Karoline exposed a truth that many had tried to ignore. She didn't hold back. With precision, confidence, and undeniable facts, she called out the double standards that have defined political debates for years. But it wasn't just what she said. It was the reaction that followed. The stunned silence, the awkward glances, the priceless expressions from those who thought they'd never be held accountable. This wasn't a slip of the tongue or a heated argument. It was a masterclass in exposing hypocrisy, delivered live, with nowhere for anyone to hide. And the moment it hit the internet, it was clear. Karoline Leavitt didn't just answer a question, she changed the conversation. The press room was packed, reporters squeezed into every available seat, cameras positioned at sharp angles, all trained on the podium where the day's headlines would be born. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was palpable, woven into every whispered conversation and every expectant glance. This wasn't an ordinary press briefing. The stakes were higher. The nation was watching, with hot-button political issues dominating the news cycle. Democrats had been relentless in their criticism of the administration, confidently pushing narratives without expecting any real pushback. Today, they thought it would be more of the same. Then Karoline Leavitt entered the room. She walked to the podium with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced. There was no nervous shuffling of papers, no rehearsed smiles, just focused determination. The chatter died down almost instantly as reporters leaned in, sensing that this wasn't going to be business as usual. The first few questions were routine, topics like policy updates and diplomatic meetings. Karoline answered them with ease, her responses sharp and controlled. But it was clear she was waiting for something more. And then it came. A liberal reporter, emboldened by the usual rhythm of press room theatrics, stood up with a smirk and fired off a question designed not to inform but to provoke. Ms. Leavitt, how do you reconcile the administration's stance on accountability when your party has a long history of ignoring its own mistakes? Isn't that the very definition of hypocrisy? The room shifted. Cameras zoomed in. Pens paused mid-sentence. Even some of the Democratic officials present leaned forward, eager to watch Karoline stumble. Or so they thought. But she didn't flinch. She didn't dodge. She smiled. A small, knowing smile. And in that moment, before she even spoke, the room felt different, because everyone realized something they hadn't expected. Karoline Leavitt wasn't on the defensive. She was about to go on the attack. The liberal reporter stood confidently, armed with a question that was meant to corner Karoline Leavitt. His tone carried a familiar arrogance, the kind you'd expect from someone who believed they were about to deliver a knockout blow in front of a live audience. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "how do you reconcile the administration's constant talk about integrity and fairness when the Republican Party has a long history of ignoring its own mistakes? Isn't that the very definition of hypocrisy?" The words hit the room like a spark to dry tinder. There was a brief pause, a heartbeat of silence. As the question settled over the crowd, some reporters glanced around, exchanging knowing looks as if they'd just witnessed the setup for what they thought would be Karoline's downfall. A few smirks crept onto faces, anticipating her struggle to respond. The question wasn't just provocative. It was designed to be a trap. It framed the narrative, casting the Republican Party as hypocritical while daring Karoline to either defend the undefendable or dodge the question entirely. The reporter's expression betrayed his confidence, already picturing the viral headlines. Press secretary stumbles when confronted on GOP hypocrisy. But Karoline didn't stumble. She didn't shift uncomfortably or flip through notes for a rehearsed response. Instead, she stood there calm and collected, her eyes locked onto the reporter with a look that said she'd been waiting for this moment. A slight tilt of her head. A pause, just long enough to let the arrogance in the room swell. And then, without missing a beat, she began to speak. What followed wasn't just an answer. It was the beginning of a verbal takedown that no one, especially the reporter, saw coming. The room held its breath, the weight of the reporter's question lingering like a challenge thrown down in the heat of battle. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every subtle detail. The smug confidence on the reporter's face, the faint smirks from others in the room, all convinced they were about to witness Karoline stumble. But Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the podium, her expression calm, almost amused. There was no rush to respond, no visible sign of frustration. Instead, she let the silence stretch, an intentional pause that turned the tension back on the reporter. And that's when it happened. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. A tiny shift in his posture, barely noticeable, but enough to betray the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated. Karoline finally leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked onto him with laser focus. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was steady, clear, and controlled. "You know," she began, her tone almost conversational, "it's interesting how questions like yours always seem to come with the same underlying assumption, that accountability is something only one side should answer for." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet confidence in her delivery was more powerful than any shout. You're quick to point fingers, to label and accuse, but where's that same energy when it comes to holding your own side accountable? She paused, letting the question hang in the air, her gaze never wavering. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Reporters glanced at each other, sensing the change. The trap the reporter had set was beginning to backfire, and everyone could feel it. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering, each word delivered with precision. "If integrity matters, and it does, then it's not selective. You don't get to demand accountability from one party while turning a blind eye to the glaring contradictions within your own." The reporter's smug expression faded, replaced by something else, discomfort. But Karoline wasn't done, not even close. She paused again, allowing the weight of her words to settle before adding, "I'll be happy to answer your question about accountability, right after you explain why it's only a problem when it's convenient for your narrative." The room was silent, the tension thick, but Karoline remained as calm as ever, standing in that silence like she owned it. Because in that moment, she did. The room was silent, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was the thick, suffocating silence that settles in just before everything explodes. Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension radiating from the reporter who had just tried and failed to corner her. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, she began. "You want to talk about double standards?" Her voice was steady, sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "Let's talk about them." She leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving the reporter. The smirk he'd worn minutes ago was gone, replaced by a tight, uncomfortable expression. "You accuse this administration of hypocrisy, yet the very people pointing fingers are the ones rewriting the rules whenever it suits them." She paused for a fraction of a second, letting the words sink in before continuing. "When Democrats call for unity, it means silence your opposition. When they preach about democracy, it means agree with them or else. And when they talk about accountability, it somehow never applies to their own scandals, failures, or lies." A ripple moved through the room. Some reporters shifted in their seats, others glanced around, unsure of how to react. But Karoline wasn't done. She was just getting started. Where was the outrage when cities burned, businesses were destroyed, and leaders called it mostly peaceful protests? Her tone grew firmer, more resolute. Where was the accountability when elected officials broke their own lockdown rules while lecturing the rest of the country about safety? The reporter tried to interject, his mouth opening slightly as if to regain control, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. "No, you asked the question. Now you're going to listen to the answer." Her words hit like a hammer, firm, final, undeniable. She continued, her voice rising just enough to fill the room without ever losing its controlled, cutting edge. "Double standards aren't just political tactics. They're the foundation of every argument built on hypocrisy. And the fact that you thought I wouldn't call it out says more about your expectations than my answers." A beat of silence followed, the kind that made every person in the room hyper-aware of their own breathing. The liberal reporter sat frozen, his confidence shattered, the arrogance he walked in with reduced to nothing more than an uncomfortable silence. Karoline didn't smirk, she didn't gloat. She simply straightened her notes, as if the verbal takedown she'd just delivered was nothing more than routine. But everyone in that room, and soon everyone watching online, knew the truth. She didn't just respond, she exposed, and there was no coming back from it. For a brief moment the room was frozen, utterly silent, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. Karoline Leavitt's words still echoed, her calm yet devastating takedown hanging in the air, like the final note of a powerful symphony. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of cameras recording what had just unfolded, a moment destined to go viral. The liberal reporter who had entered the room with smug confidence now sat motionless. His face, once animated with self-assured arrogance, had drained of expression. His lips were slightly parted, as if searching for words that would never come. He fumbled with his notepad, avoiding eye contact, his earlier bravado replaced with visible discomfort. The regret was written all over his face, a realization that he hadn't just lost control of the narrative, he'd become the narrative. But it wasn't just him. Across the room, reporters exchanged awkward glances. Some tried to maintain their professional composure, but you could see it. The slight raise of an eyebrow, the tightening of a jaw, the quick scribbling of notes not to document Karoline's words, but to distract themselves from the palpable tension. A few couldn't suppress faint smirks, not at Karoline's triumph, but at the sheer audacity of what they'd just witnessed. She hadn't just answered a question, she'd turned the press room into a masterclass on exposing hypocrisy. Then came the subtle reactions, the priceless ones. A microphone caught the faintest sound of someone clearing their throat, a nervous attempt to break the silence. Another reporter shifted uncomfortably in their seat, glancing down at their notes, pretending to find something urgent to read. Cameras panned slowly, capturing every flicker of discomfort, every forced smile, every twitch that betrayed the stunned disbelief. The liberal reporter finally mustered the courage to speak, but all that came out was a weak, mumbled attempt at a follow-up question, his voice shaky and lacking the conviction he'd entered with. Karoline didn't even dignify it with a response. She simply adjusted the microphone, straightened her notes, and moved on to the next reporter, her composure unshaken. But the damage was done. Within minutes of the press conference ending, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Headlines exploded across the internet. Karoline Leavitt dismantles reporter's hypocrisy on live TV. Press room goes silent after Leavitt's epic response. Reporter's confidence crumbles after Karoline's savage takedown. The internet did what it does best. Memes surfaced, freeze-framing the exact moment the reporter's face shifted from confidence to regret. Side-by-side screenshots compared his smug before with his stunned after. Comment sections flooded with reactions. She owned him. That's how you handle biased questions. Instant regret caught in 4K. Karoline didn't tweet about it. She didn't post a victory lap on social media. She didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any words could. And while the reporter tried to recover, issuing half-hearted explanations and defensive statements in the days that followed, it was too late. His reaction, the priceless, unscripted look of defeat, was immortalized. Because in that room on that day, Karoline Leavitt didn't just win an argument. She left a mark. And the look on their faces said it all. The moment the press conference ended, the real storm began. Within minutes, the clip of Karoline Leavitt's takedown hit social media like a lightning bolt. It wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. The footage, raw and unedited, captured the exact moment the liberal reporter's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by an expression of pure, undeniable regret. The internet didn't just watch it, they devoured it. Hashtags exploded almost instantly. Hashtag Karoline exposes the truth. Hashtag double standards revealed. Hashtag priceless reaction. Hashtag instant regret. Hashtag mic drop moment. What started as a press conference clip transformed into an online phenomenon. Conservative influencers were the first to pounce. They flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube with reaction videos, breaking down Karoline's every word like it was part of a political playbook on how to handle the media. Video titles popped up everywhere. Karoline Leavitt destroys liberal reporter on live TV. Watch this savage moment. This is how you handle fake news. Karoline's epic clapback goes viral. Press conference masterclass. Karoline leaves reporter speechless. It wasn't just political commentators getting in on the action, even meme pages, apolitical influencers, and viral content accounts picked up the clip. It was too good to ignore. A perfect storm of political drama, sharp wit, and a priceless reaction caught on camera. But it didn't stop there. Mainstream news outlets scrambled to catch up. Major networks like CNN and MSNBC tried to downplay the moment, framing it as contentious or divisive, carefully avoiding words like embarrassing or defeat. But the problem was, the footage didn't lie. No matter how they spun it, the raw, unfiltered video was already out there. And every time they tried to twist the narrative, more people clicked on the original clip to see for themselves, and every single view told the same story. Karoline Leavitt had dominated the exchange. By the end of the first day, the clip had surpassed 10 million views across platforms. By the end of the week, it was being referred to as the press conference moment that broke the internet. Meme culture exploded. Screenshots of the reporter's face frozen in the exact moment his confidence shattered became instant classics. Captions flooded timelines when you realize you're not the smartest person in the room. Plot twist, it didn't go as planned. When the clapback hits harder than expected. Insert foot here, GIFs of Karoline's mic drop moment trended on platforms like Reddit, used in every context imaginable, from sports arguments to reality TV recaps. The cultural impact had transcended politics. It had become the reaction template for anyone who'd ever been shut down in an argument. Late-night comedy shows tried to mock the situation, attempting to flip the narrative with their usual satire. But even their jokes felt forced, overshadowed by the undeniable fact that Karoline had delivered a takedown so clean, so precise that it didn't need any exaggeration. The comedy was already built into the reality of what happened. Meanwhile, political commentators from both sides weighed in. Conservatives hailed it as a defining moment, proof that the so-called mainstream media could no longer control the narrative unchallenged. Liberals, caught off guard, scrambled to defend the reporter, claiming the question was misunderstood or taken out of context, but none of it mattered. The internet had already decided. Karoline Leavitt's response wasn't just viral, it became the benchmark for handling media bias. Political influencers cited it in debates, reaction channels dissected every facial expression. Even high school debate coaches joked about showing it in class as an example of how to maintain composure under pressure. And Karoline? She didn't tweet about it. She didn't go on interviews to bask in the attention. She didn't even acknowledge the viral storm, because she didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any tweet ever could. The footage was doing all the talking. While the reporter tried to recover, issuing half-hearted clarifications and scrambling for damage control, Karoline carried on as if it was just another day at the office. No victory lap, no gloating. And that's what made it even more powerful. Because when the dust settled, one thing was clear. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win an argument. She owned the narrative, and the ripple effects were just beginning. In the end, it wasn't just a press conference. It wasn't just another viral clip destined to trend for a few hours before fading into the digital abyss. What Karoline Leavitt did that day was more than a sharp comeback or a clever retort. It was a defining moment, a masterclass in composure, courage, and the power of standing up to narratives crafted not for truth, but for control. Karoline didn't rely on theatrics. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to personal attacks or get drawn into emotional outbursts that so many fall victim to under the blinding glare of the media spotlight. She stood there, calm, confident, unshaken. Her weapon wasn't outrage. It was facts, delivered with surgical precision and the kind of quiet conviction that hits harder than any shouted argument. But this wasn't just about humiliating a reporter. It wasn't just about winning a debate in front of cameras. What Karoline exposed that day was something much bigger, an entire ecosystem built on double standards, selective outrage, and the assumption that no one would dare call it out. Until she did. Her words didn't just dismantle a question. They dismantled a mindset, one that thrives on the belief that if you control the narrative, you control the truth. But Karoline proved that day that the truth doesn't need to be controlled. It doesn't need to be packaged in sound bites or hidden behind biased headlines. The truth stands on its own, and when delivered fearlessly, it doesn't just echo in a room, it reverberates across the world. And that's exactly what happened. The press room wasn't just filled with stunned silence, it was filled with realization, the kind that settles in when someone finally says out loud what everyone else has been thinking, but was too afraid to admit. Karoline didn't just answer a question, she flipped the script. She held up a mirror to the very people who believed they were untouchable and forced them to see what they'd been hiding from themselves. The aftermath, the viral clips, the trending hashtags, the endless reactions was inevitable. But the real impact wasn't in the views or the shares, it was in the shift, the crack in the armor of media bias, the realization that even the most polished narratives can crumble with a single well-placed truth. Because here's the thing, you can control a headline, but you can't control a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. You can spin a story, but you can't spin the look of regret on someone's face when they realize they've lost the argument they thought they'd already won. Karoline's silence after the incident was just as powerful as her words. She didn't flood social media with victory posts. She didn't need to. The clip spoke for itself. The world had already decided, and no amount of media spin could put the genie back in the bottle. But beyond the headlines and viral fame, there's a deeper takeaway. It's a reminder that courage isn't found in shouting the loudest. It's found in standing firm when it matters most, in speaking the truth even when the room is designed to make you doubt yourself. It's about knowing that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that doesn't shake, even when the world is trying to rattle you. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win an argument that day. She set a new standard, a standard that says, you don't have to play by their rules to win the game. So what does this moment really mean? It means that integrity isn't about avoiding confrontation. It's about facing it head-on, armed with nothing but the truth. It means that the narrative isn't controlled by the loudest voices. It's controlled by the most authentic ones. And it means that no matter how carefully someone tries to shape a story, the truth has a way of cutting through the noise like a knife through glass. Karoline didn't just have a viral moment. She created a ripple effect, one that reminded people everywhere that the truth doesn't need permission to be heard. Now the question is, was this just a press conference, or the moment everything changed? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the narrative.